Hello there. How y'all doing? Good. I went to camp with Nolan Bushnell's kids. And his daughter, Britta, used to bring the Atari cartridges as like serious leverage swag. So there's that.
Get a lot of extra desserts for.
I mean, like that was it at the time. Could you imagine having that currency at summer camp? So anyway, I needed to bring that up because this is like a Bushnell celebration. So should we introduce ourselves?
Sure.
I'm not really moderating. We just were told we're having a conversation. So we're going to converse. Peter Levin most recently served as president of Interactive Ventures Games and Digital Strategy at Lionsgate, now managing director at Griffin Gaming Partners, a early and later stage fund singularly focused on the game space across all disciplines.
Mike Sepso, co-founder of Major League Gaming, formerly head of the Esports and Media division at Activision Blizzard, and now chairman of Electronic Sports Group and partner in the New York Excelsior.
So I think one of the things we were talking about was we're kind of two of the OG esports guys. Like when I got into it, it was just competitive gaming.
Right.
There wasn't the esports. And so I think that's, I think we can probably start there.
Yeah.
And kind of get to where we see it currently, where we see it going. But I think having that kind of, that forensic, the ability to look in the rearview mirror is very helpful with the maturation of what's going on in esports. So maybe you want to talk.
Yeah. So we started Major League Gaming in 2002. So way before it was called esports. We actually were trying to push for it, just calling it Major League Gaming. Didn't take, but so like Peter said, I think back in that era, we were just sort of playing around with something out of passion that gaming had always been sort of social and competitive for me as a kid, playing Atari games and things like that, and seeing online multiplayer kind of really take off. Just sort of gelled in our heads that this could be a competitive sport, and it, getting to, was my whole gaming life kind of leading up through college, where I was playing Doom and Quake on our computer lab, which I guess colleges don't have computer labs anymore, but they used to, which were basically just LAN centers for Quake. But the kids today,
Didn't tell your parents that.
yeah.
Studying hard.
Anyway, that was the sort of genesis of it. And Sundance DiGiovanni, the other co-founder, and I, we were Halo players and we were formerly Quake players, and we kind of saw where things were headed, which was there was going to be a way to build community and eventually a sports media business around getting people to compete against each other in video games. And then we actually realized that was already happening in Korea. And we kind of took that model for what was happening and tried to come up with sort of the NASCAR version of that. And lots of things happened in the 17 years preceding that, which we can talk about.
Well, I think in my background in the competitive game space, I was an A-round investor in a company back in the day. First investment I ever made in GameSpy Industries, which was an incredibly innovative middleware product at the time, allowed for connectivity globally.
Yep.
For multiplayer competitive gaming. And we dabbled kind of before bandwidth was commoditized with streaming of competitive games, the games that Mike was referencing, Quake and Doom and Half-Life, and realized the more we served up these streams, the more money we lost because it was, again, pre-commoditization of the bandwidth. But the appetite was significant, and so we lost a ton of money doing it. So we pulled the plug, but what we did realize was whatever market commoditizes the bandwidth first is going to crush this, which was Korea. So, similar experience, and,
Yep.
and that created that very unique beachhead, for the Korean marketplace. So we knew to keep our eye on it from that point in time, and I became an early investor in the esports franchise Immortals. I think one of the franchises backed by folks like AEG and Meg Whitman and Mike Milken, Steve Kaplan, similar to the New York Excelsior, you guys. It's a storied group. We have a very long view on the esports franchise. With AEG as a partner, they came in and said, look, we built the Major League Soccer League in partnership with some great owners, but it took us 25 years, right? And now these franchises are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and but it was a slow burn, and it was a very calculated exercise. And AEG said the same thing to us. They're like, we want to come into this, but this isn't a traditional venture-backed exercise. You have to have a long view. This thing is going to pivot 18 ways to Wednesday before it figures out what it wants to be, and you need to be prepared for that. And I think having the kinds of owners that we have, and the honor of serving as chairman of that board, having the kind of ownership group behind New York, the quality globally of ownership that's gravitating towards the space is heartening and gives us a lot of confidence in a very dynamic marketplace.
Yeah, and I guess maybe the lead into sort of how our paths in the industry came together. Well, first, if it wasn't for GameSpy, we wouldn't have been able to play Halo online in the first Xbox, and probably Major League Gaming wouldn't have happened. So, thanks for that. Thanks for losing that money.
Yeah. Our pleasure.
We went on to create MLG and lose a lot more money. So.
Yeah. That's the model.
But one of the things that has, I would say, sort of pre-2016 esports, that was always the sort of existential question for the industry, and was something that we dealt with every day at MLG, was we were creating a sports league and a media product around a playing field that we didn't own. And so the kind of key difference between traditional sports and esports is, baseball and basketball are sort of public domain activities. Nobody owns the sport. The NBA owns the league and controls the rights to that league, but you can go start a basketball league tomorrow. In fact, people create football leagues all the time, right? But in esports, you need somebody's permission to do that. So my first brush with the video game industry, since Sundance and I had no business starting MLG in the first place, we had no background in the video game industry, and our first interaction with the video game industry was through cease and desist letters. And it didn't get a lot better from there for a long time. But the key was you were trying to create a new property around something that we didn't own. It was somebody else's IP, and eventually that turned into a variety of different kind of partnerships, from licensing the rights to the games to providing a sort of mixed vendor and partner services kind of thing. Eventually, after many conversations with Bobby Kotick, he brought me in to start what was called the Media Networks division at Activision Blizzard at the time, and then we acquired MLG wholly later that year in 2015. And that kind of was, to me, sort of, obviously, I'm looking at it from my perspective, but I think for the entire industry, that was a sort of major transition point for the industry, because it basically brought the means to operate a league and produce the video content and all the sort of surrounding commercialization of esports inside the rights owner. So that was not an easy transition. Some friends in the audience and I were just talking about how difficult that is to kind of create a league and be a studio and publishing business all under the same hood. But what it allowed us to do was, for the first time, really create a franchise league model, which was hotly debated whether that was even a fit for esports, whether it would be good for the ecosystem, whether it would push out the endemic organizations and fans and players that had kind of been a part of it for a long time. And I think, just having been through the experience of this sort of 13 years prior to rolling that sort of structure out to the masses, it just made a ton of sense. Like, one of the things I always say in esports is we're not inventing sports. Sports exists. There's a model for it. It's been perfected over 100 years. There's great kind of reference points to take and borrow to build esports around. So I think that was kind of the major accomplishment that we were able to do at Activision Blizzard, was kind of take the DNA of MLG, apply it to the game franchises, integrate with the studios and the publishing units, and really roll out something special, which now is the Overwatch League, and eventually will be other leagues. And I think Riot kind of transitioned to a franchise model quickly after that rollout. And so I think that, to me, is sort of like a major turning point in the history of esports, and that now you have something that's big, persistent, can last forever, and it's investable, right? There's an investment thesis behind it.
Yeah, and I think from the content side of it, I've always straddled both the content media side of it and the game side of it my entire career, kind of been a bridge between the two constituencies. But for media companies and even industries of sport, traditional sport, they were watching their customers flee by the millions. This is a consuming constituency that will never see a cable bill. They won't see a satellite bill. They don't understand, scheduled programming. And so when so much of what you predicate your success upon is engagement with that demographic, esports and competitive gaming provided a conduit, a consistent conduit back into that audience. So I think that's part of the reason why you see a lot of globally traditional media embracing esports. I think it's why you see so many sports franchises and leagues figuring out their own way into the room. I think for content players, one of the things we did at Lionsgate is we had the first ever player versus player real-time fighting game based on the Power Rangers IP. And we did a ton of competitive activation around that game globally at a really small scale. And I think one of the other things that's very compelling about esports, it's akin to the metaphor I use is like on ESPN, or on Sky, you can watch Premier League, you can watch Formula One, you can watch the NFL. You can also watch competitive cornhole, right? I kid you not. And so there's professional cornhole and darts, right? So there's a spectrum of content that scales up and it also scales down, and there are successful models to deploy against that. I think in competitive gaming, it's the same thing. If you own and control IP and you have a portfolio of IP to play with and you have an invested global audience, there's no reason why you can't have competitive experiences built around that. I think what you guys did, and with Bobby and with our franchise, we own an Overwatch team. Not only did they come up with a model that resonated globally, because it's something people were familiar enough with, but they also hired against the problem. And I think so much of the traditional DNA on the publisher side was esports is a marketing and promotional vehicle. And the same people, once it became commercialized, like, oh, this is now a revenue center, you can't have those same people who look at the exercise as a marketing or promotion exercise running a commercial league. But you need people who understand what it means to stand up a 21st century next generation league. They need to understand what it means to do global distribution rights and windowing rights and licensing and merchandising. Yep. These are all new disciplines for a lot of these publishers. And I think what Bobby has done well has hired against that problem, bringing yourself in there, bringing in the quality of execs, that we interoperate with regularly. It's really important to have those folks intermingle with the traditional side of the house on the publishing side, on the marketing side, but they bring a very discrete DNA and decades of experience doing that other thing, which is mission critical. And I think, again, it's a roadmap for some of the other publishers. They may not have the same budget as Activision, but let's say they have an nth of that budget. They can scale then to an nth. They can bring in some of that external DNA that understand, how to operate that type of a business, because it's very far afield from the traditional games publishing business.
Yeah, and I think you'd agree that the rollout of Overwatch League created kind of a seismic shift in the business, and I can tell you kind of firsthand. Before we started the actual league, after we had announced it and got the first slate of teams in, I was still inside Activision Blizzard and running the commercial operations. And before the first game was played.
You mean the game that we won against the San Francisco Shock? Yes,
right.
That game.
That is right. Before the first game was played in the first season, we had generated more revenue through sponsorship and media rights deals than the prior probably 8 or 9 years at MLG combined. Really just completely about the structure and the scale and the ambition of what this thing was going to be. And I think that sort of marked a proof point for the industry that we're not just talking about kind of endemic equipment sponsors and things like that. We're not just talking about Twitch and YouTube. We're also talking about ESPN, and we're talking about the Coca-Colas of the world and the Bud Lights and things like that. So I think that's the next step for where this industry is heading. I think we've now surpassed the point of saying, like, is this really going to be a thing, right? So for 15 years, I was walking around arguing with people that this would really be a thing.
Well, Well, now it's funny because I just got back from the Middle East and we're heading off to Japan in a couple of weeks where I've spent a lot of time, and it's gotten to the point where if you're in media and you're global, you have to be in gaming, right? It's no longer a luxury or like, oh, this would be a fun sidecar thing to do. It's like, no, it's mission critical, to your strategic roadmap if it's an audience and a demographic that you have any interest in retaining a relationship with. I mean, I think it's nothing shy, of that. And I think there was a few years of question marks around like, oh, is this, the next shiny toy?
Right.
And so is not. And just because North America, I think was late to mature, other parts of the world, in particular parts of the world where there was not console penetration. So you're talking Eastern Europe and you're talking China, you're talking Brazil, right? This has been a fixture of media for many, many years. So kind of as the U.S. has caught up and you realize it's a global enterprise, that's also another area of maturation. You've got the subcontinent, which has a sub 10% penetration of smartphones at this point, and it's about to explode. So that's close to another billion of addressable audience on top of the 2.6 billion people that play games right now. 10 years ago, that was just north of 200 million. And back then, it was like 90% male. Now it's 50% female. And it's north of 2.6 billion with, again, just in the subcontinent alone, another billion to address. That's a lot of ceiling.
Yeah.
Right?
No, and I think that's specific to esports. One of the things that's always been really interesting to me is if you think about almost every kind of sort of major cultural entertainment vehicle or vertical, usually it's invented here, right? Either LA or New York, and it's exported to the rest of the world, whether that's sort of movie stars or pop stars or whatever. We kind of create mainstream entertainment in Hollywood, and we export it to the rest of the world. It's actually one of our biggest exports. And esports, and to a certain extent, I think also just gaming generally, is really something that's grown and scaled in Asia and is being brought here. So it's kind of a significant reversal of the traditional entertainment model. And the really interesting thing to me is that means that the U.S. or sort of North America generally is the growth market now for esports, which is super interesting because if you think about this as effectively it's a media product, right? All traditional sports and esports are media products. This is the best media market in the world. So the upside is really nice. You're not sort of taking something that's mature in the U.S. and trying to bring it to kind of less mature media markets. It's actually happening in reverse. And so I think while everybody, sort of in the industry is relatively bullish on esports, I'm probably, kind of 5x that in terms of what I think the potential is going to be. Especially as you think about how the generational wave is kind of happening, where you see the massive decline in attach rates for audience for traditional sports and traditional television, and a really distinct move of younger audiences toward esports and gaming and digital. To me, that just is a massive, massive opportunity. The television industry alone, just in this country, is over $80 billion a year in ad revenue. And that is starting to migrate over to things like esports. So I think the upside is tremendous, and I think that kind of cash inflow will start to power a lot of really interesting innovation.
And I think, again, you couple to that what's happening with cloud gaming and 5G. Right? So all of a sudden, in the last 6 weeks, right, you had Google with Stadia, you had Apple announce Arcade, you had Snap announce their games platform. Amazon has announced, they're throwing their hat into the ring. You've got Microsoft with Azure, the backbone there. They're clearly going to be a player. They've bought more studios in the last 18 months than they have in the history of the company. So all of a sudden, Verizon, AT&T, there's all these new actors in the theater with respect to gaming and competitive gaming and esports. They're all going to want to have differentiated services and become, quote unquote, the Netflix of gaming, which is just a fantastic opportunity for, content, right? So there's going to be a ton of content. There's going to be a lot of differentiation. All these services are going to be looking to distinguish themselves, set themselves apart. So that just means, again, more studios are going to get gobbled up, more investment into the market for market growth, versus short-term ROI, which is great. That'll lead to a lot of innovation. And with a global, perspective for most of the entities that we're talking about. So they're all, global players. So as you stated, with North America being a growth market, which is somewhat anomalous for us with respect to anything in media, we also get to, again, kind of glean what worked in certain markets and what didn't, and we can learn from some of the mistakes and apply them, against what's happening in the marketplace.
I think that's right. So what do you think is going to be the next big thing in esports, Peter?
What do I think the next big thing? I mean, mobile, we've been saying it for a while, but I mean, mobile is where it's at. We've yet to see kind of the breakout mobile competitive experience.
Yeah.
I loved what they did with Clash Royale.
Yeah.
We were the #1 team in North America. Got our butts kicked in Japan. But look, other than if you're a guy, you're not leaving the house without your wallet, and if you're a woman, you're not leaving your house with whatever it is you carry your stuff within. The only other thing you go back for is your phone, right? And so if you look at, anytime you're anywhere with a gaggle of kids, like they're all just head down on the phone. There's problems with that, by the way. But we aren't going to get it. This isn't that panel. But that's what they're doing. So if you want to get them where they are, that is where they are. And so I think, very excited about what the next couple of years are going to mean competitively for mobile esports.
Yeah, I would agree. I think mobile is a massive opportunity. I think also, we're seeing a maturation in brands and advertisers' understanding of how to address the space. I think the next kind of near-term major thing that we'll see is broader adoption by both traditional and big digital media players on the distribution side, right? I think we've, as an industry, Peter mentioned earlier, before streaming was commoditized, it was really expensive. For the first more than half of MLG's existence, we paid a ton of money for bandwidth just to stream video to people. And then Twitch happened and YouTube happened, and that part of the industry got commoditized. What hasn't really happened, though, is kind of what you were mentioning, the sort of, what's the Netflix, what's the Hulu, or is it just Netflix and Hulu?
I think at some point Netflix is going to say, no, we're going to be the Netflix of
Right, right.
That's going to work.
I think ESPN has said we're going to be the ESPN of esports. And actually, though, it hasn't always been that way. I was going to mention earlier, I remember very clearly a conversation in 2006 with the then head of programming at ESPN, who's now the AD at Syracuse and a really good guy, telling me that there's really just no way that they're ever going to broadcast esports. At the time, we
They said the same thing about the UFC.
That is true.
Now they just paid several $1 billion for the rights. So.
And a few weeks ago, I was watching our Stage 1 playoffs on not just ESPN but ABC. On a Sunday afternoon at a very traditional sports time slot. So I think that is an indication to me, not necessarily that esports is going back towards linear. I think I've always gotten asked that question, like, when are you going to put esports on TV? And I say, USA Network, 2006, 7-episode series. We did it a long time ago. But I think more distributors focused on the content, focused on presenting it in different ways. While Twitch has been critically important to the growth of the industry, especially because of the removing the cost barrier to streaming, it's clearly not the most premium destination for video. It's a community. It's a community destination. It's community tools. It's not kind of a linear broadcast thing for premium content. And I think lots of other distributors are going to get into that race, and we're going to see lots of innovation on that side too.
Yeah, I think as I was talking about, just the actors that we mentioned that have entered the theater, and there's going to be more of them, Comcast, Disney Plus. That's nothing but great for the consumer. And I love the fact that they have the intestinal fortitude to A/B test and take all these shots on goal.
Right.
Because look, I don't think, as you stated, I don't think linear programming is going to be the end-all be-all for competitive gaming. I just don't. It's a novelty. It's fun to see. I've gone into many a sports bar while traveling. Like, you got to throw up, Overwatch League on your TV, and you get that sideways look, and then they put it up there, and everyone gets amused and checks it out. But I don't think it's going to be the end-all be-all for competitive esports athletes to see their highlights on SportsCenter. It'll be whatever the next generation of that is on whatever the next generation platform is. And where I 1,000% agree is there's tons of room for innovation with respect to what Twitch has been able to do, and it's incredible what they've been able to do.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of room to play and differentiate, and you've got a lot of folks out there in big media and big tech that have a lot to lose, by losing this audience.
That's right.
And so they're going to invest, and they're going to continue to create innovative platforms. I was excited about Caffeine entering the fray, right?
Yep.
With Fox putting 100 million behind it. Like, good for them. And
Yeah.
you're going to see more of that. And that just means more distribution outlets, optionality, market tension. These are all things that are incredibly positive. You guys were so early and so innovative, but you were kind of like a lone voice out there. And I think, to have that portfolio of players is a huge bellwether for, again, the viability long-term
Yeah.
of competitive gaming.
Totally.
Maybe should we open it up?
Yeah, you want to?
We have a couple
have a
minutes
question?
left.
There we go. In the next, say, short term, say 12 to 18 months, what do you think the highlights are going to be in the esports area from a business or a consumer point of view?
My perspective is just what we were talking about. I think a bigger influx of investment, not just in capital, but in sort of resources applied to esports from major consumer brands and traditional, and I can kind of at scale digital distributors. I think that'll be the really big thing that happens over the next year and a half.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, again, the type of sophisticated investors globally that are getting into this with not funny money, right? This isn't tourist capital. There's a lot of smart folks out there that realize we need to be in this. What is the right way? And that could be in the form of brands. Again, just as partners with AEG, we've been able to tie up with, some of the biggest brands globally. And we hear the anecdotes of when they go in, these are the same brands that are buying inventory at Staples Center right down the road. And the O2 in London and globally where AEG has its tentacles. But they're really excited on the buy side to be able to now play in esports, right, with a portfolio of activation across traditional sport and within esports. So I think you're seeing more and more of that happening. You're going to see kind of what Snapple did with Howard Stern, back in the day, which defined that brand for Snapple. You're going to see those types of activations and partnerships, again, in a pretty unique way.
I think we have time for one more.
As the games evolve, do you think the leagues will change games, stay the same leagues, or do you think the games will just grow with the technology? How do you see that happening over the next 15 years?
I freak out when anyone says the next 15 years of anything, so I'll let you take that.
I think that games generally, one of the impacts that esports, I think, and mobile maybe more so even, has had on the industry is that games have become kind of less annual release cycle, complete refresh, and are more kind of a living, breathing thing that evolves over time. So I think that that's probably the model that most games that are a component, the core component of a big esports league structure will follow. And I think it's a virtuous cycle. The esports league will promote the constant attachment and interest in the game, and it'll continue. Honestly, one of the things that I think is great about esports is it provides this incredible set of data set back to the studios who they're seeing the best players kind of bang on this thing all day long and figure out new exploits and strategies and things like that. And so in many ways the studios are becoming an integral part of the esports leagues because they have to keep evolving the game too, not just to keep it competitive, but also to keep it interesting and to keep it watchable, right? You're not just thinking about the mechanics of a game and how you play it, but you have to think about how is it going to look on TV. So that I think that will be kind of a continual. That's the new model, like a virtuous cycle of game ongoing development and evolution as the league grows.
I think we're getting Das Boot.
Oh yeah, we're out. Thanks everybody.